today with Dr. Gary Neubauer. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Walt. My name is Dr. Gary Neubauer. I am the Senior Manager of Veterinary Operations for the dairy side on the eastern half of the U.S. for Pfizer Animal Health.
Today we're going to be talking about Salmonella. Tell us a little bit about the disease. What is it?
Well, Walt, Salmonellosis is a bacterial pathogen that can infect cattle and actually all species of animals and even humans. When we start looking at the first signs of an acute Salmonella infection in cattle, we'll normally see some weakness, inappetence, and lethargy. And then most commonly observed signs that we normally will see will be fever and diarrhea. However, not all cows will have a fever, so you have to keep that in mind. And then you start looking at fecal consistency. Normally some of these acutely infected cows will range very widely on the amount of diarrhea that they have, from watery to bloody, and consistency as far as yellow material and cast that we call that. Then, of course, some other signs that we might see with cattle salmonellosis might include dehydration, a decrease in milk production, possibly some abortions. Young calves are particularly susceptible and can get some severe blood infections that will also cause fever, diarrhea, pneumonia, sudden death, and even arthritis. One other thing, too, Walt, is I think that we fail to realize that Salmonella can also cause subclinical infections. So these animals can have no signs whatsoever and still be shedding the disease, which makes it a very, very difficult disease to comprehend. When we look at Salmonella, it can also infect humans. And human outbreaks of Salmonella are associated with a lot of food products, animal origin. When we look at some of the issues on the human side, foodborne transmission accounts for 95% of the estimated 1.4 million human cases of Salmonella that we see in the U.S. And that calculates to an economic ramification of anywhere from 600 million to 3.5 billion economic loss. There's about 16,000 hospitalizations each year, and unfortunately 400 to 600 deaths that can occur in humans due to Salmonella.
This sounds like an important disease for dairy producers to control. How prevalent do you find this disease on dairies in the U.S.?
When we start looking at some of the studies, especially using the National Animal Health Monitoring System studies from 2009, and looking at fecal samples from cows, there's about 13.7% of cows infected in the country, according to that study in 2009, which accounted to about 39.7% of farms that are infected. However, when we look at environmental sampling, not just sampling cows, but sampling the environment that the cows live in, 61% of dairies with over 500 head were positive, and smaller dairies under 500 head, over 41% of those dairies were infected with salmonellosis. Sometimes you can also look at salmonella in bulk tanks and in inline filters, and herds greater than 500 head, there's almost 51% of those herds that were positive for salmonella in either the bulk tank or the inline filter. And all operations around the country, dairy farms, it was about 28.1%. So it can be very, very prevalent. And when you look at the economic impacts to the cattle industry and the dairy industry, you need to include death losses and reduced milk yield and abortion and weight loss, poor feed efficiency, treatment costs. All those things can really add up significantly to the producer.
Obviously, the clinical cases of Salmonella will be easy for a producer to catch. What are some of the subclinical effects that a producer may not recognize immediately?
As we had said earlier, the clinical infections are just the tip of the iceberg. And the subclinical salmonellosis are really a serious threat, I think, to cattle producers because it yields animals that can eventually become sick. They're shedding, they're showing those signs, and spreading the pathogen to other animals on the operation. And over a period of time, then, these can lead to a lowering of production, can lead to more susceptibility to other infections, some poor reproduction, just a variety of things, especially in our calves, where their immune systems maybe aren't quite as good. They are going to be more susceptible, and their efficiency on growth, their efficiency on withstanding other disease challenges become diminished. So that's why I think it's important for producers to work with their veterinarians. The clinical salmonella cases are pretty obvious. Severe outbreaks, bloody diarrhea, very sick animals, death losses. But veterinarians can help their producers look at the other environmental risks for subclinical salmonellosis by doing some environmental cultures, by looking at fecal cultures on some animals that may be at risk, such as in the transition period or the fresh pen would be areas that I would maybe be looking at just to see once what your exposure exposure rate might be.
How does Salmonella gain access to the farm?
Well, salmonella can have access in many, many varieties. We can bring it in through cattle, replacement heifers, or replacement cows. Calves can pick it up from the environment and from cows and other livestock. The trucks that transport our animals back and forth can be a source of infection. We can carry salmonella on our boots. It can be transferred to the water, our water supplies, contaminated feed, and then, of course, birds and rodents can all harbor salmonella and basically shed it in our feed.
Of all of these different sources, which one poses the highest risk for producers?
Well, once again, there's been several studies, and a very nice study done in Great Britain looked at some of the risk factors for salmonella. And when you look at cattle that go through some auction barns or dealer premises, they were over 14 times greater to have a risk of salmonella. When you look at newly purchased cattle, and even if you use the correct biosecurity of isolating them for 4 weeks before you introduce them to the rest of the herd, that was still a 2.5 times greater risk of salmonella. When we purchase cattle from dealers, not through an auction barn, but just from a dealer, as compared to directly going to farms and purchasing cattle, that was 3.9% greater chance because of the exposure that those dealers might have on their clothes and on their boots and on their trucks and things of that nature. Then you start looking at persistently contaminated buildings, some of our bedding packs, some of our hutches that will have bedding packs and animals that were sick. About 2.5 times greater chance of salmonella for a risk factor. Those herds that don't have isolation facilities, those herds that use a fresh pen with their sick pen, that's 1.5 times greater chance of salmonella. And then some other interesting things, a high population or density of cats around the farm increases the risk of salmonella by about 1.35%. And then any access from birds or wild animals or rodents had a risk factor of 1.67% on some of those things that we see with an increased risk of salmonella.
As you look to help producers manage their risk for the factors that they are exposed to, which ones are producers able to control themselves?
Well, again, when we look at things that can be controlled by a dairy producer on the farm, well, I think one of the first things would be purchasing any replacement stock directly from farm if possible, rather than going through an auction barn or a dealer or broker. That just will help reduce some of those risks. Using good biosecurity measures such as quarantining any purchased cattle or calves for up to 4 weeks really helps reduce any spread of salmonella. Housing sick animals in isolation areas, again, will keep down that spread. And of course, preventing wild bird and rodent access to the feed stores is always a must. And now we have some new tools, and vaccination can also help. But I think some of the other areas that really one can concentrate on then is simply limiting the source of the infection. The maternity pen is an excellent management area that we should concentrate on. Colostrum management is another area that will help us tremendously. And just simply a high level of nutrition so that these animals can have good immunity to fight off some of those infections are other things that we can control on the farm.
Thank you for coming on the program, Dr. Neubauer, and discussing salmonella. It's a great follow-up to the article that was in the September 22nd, 2011 issue of Progressive Dairyman on this topic. What other resources are out there for producers?
Well, again, thank you for allowing me to be part of your webinar. There's a new educational online resource that producers, veterinarians, and others can access. It's at www.salmonellarisk.com. I think you find it a great resource with a lot of information about salmonella and all the risk factors. Goes into much more detail than what we just discussed here today. Again, thank you, Walt, for having me on, and I hope that producers will be able to get a good handle on salmonella and some of the risk factors that they may be encountering.